Have you ever wanted to compose a soundtrack that sounds like it belongs in the blockbuster Marvel movie? Today we're going on a journey into the world of heroic soundtrack composing, and I will walk you through some essential composing techniques, including scoring, harmony, orchestration in your DAW, and everything you need to elevate your next composition to the next level. What makes a piece of music truly heroic? It all starts with storytelling. Before you start writing, you need to imagine the kind of story you want to tell. It's just like making a movie. Filmmakers need to decide the kind of emotions they want to convey to the audience. Is it sad, optimistic, powerful? Does it tell a romantic tale or a story of vengeance? The heroic music I'm picturing is in the style of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Captain America, who embodies justice. Close your eyes and imagine it. After a hard-fought battle, a victory celebration breaks out. Captain America marches forward, his shield gleaming as the crowd cheers for his triumph. How we love seeing this iconic hero on screen and how timeless this movie is. In this tutorial, we're going to use the same orchestration techniques found in the Captain America soundtrack to help you create your own heroic theme. Of course, since we're making music for our own hero, let's call our own hero Captain North America. Did you know there's actually a Marvel hero named Captain Canuck? Who knows, maybe Marvel will make a movie about him featuring your music in the future. You'll find the full score linked in the description, and you can also check out the final recorded piece performed by 4 amazing brass players and a snare drum player, with me playing the auxiliary percussion. In music, the terms for opening and closing can vary depending on the genre. Here's a few examples if you like to familiarize yourself with the terminologies. Over the years, I've developed the habit of writing the beginning and the ending of a piece first. It's like writing a novel. Only when you know how the story ends, you can determine the transitions, how many chapters are needed, where the climax goes, and the overall structure of the work. So let's talk about the beginning and closing of this music, and then we will move on to the main section. I've constructed a fanfare opening starting in A major. While this opening isn't part of the final recorded version, I decided to cut it because as a standalone piece, it was a bit lengthy to grab the listener's attention right away. Unfortunately, audience attention spans these days are a bit like a flash of lightning, but I still want to highlight some key techniques used in the traditional fanfare music. A typical fanfare features the use of brass instruments. Here we have 4 French horns playing the main lines, with 2 trumpets and trombones playing pesante. Pesante means heavy in Italian. The bass trombone and the tuba provide a loud, regal sound. And below we have percussion instruments like timpani, crash cymbal, and suspended cymbal to add more grandeur. And since this piece reflects the victory celebration of Captain North America, we're using the snare drum throughout to keep a steady driving rhythm. You'll also notice the 2/4 time signature giving that classic marching rhythm, 1, 2, 1, 2. There are many other fanfare pieces I'd highly recommend listening to, including my personal favorite, Fanfare for the Common Man by American composer Aaron Copland. And of course, there's the most iconic fanfare you've all probably heard of, the opening theme of the 20th Century Fox logo, which is a classic fanfare. Since the fanfare opening isn't part of the final recorded music, let's now shift our focus to the closing section before moving on to the main body of the piece. In the closing section, I've used a lot of the same patterns from the fanfare opening. For example, the staccato that the woodwinds and brass play. You will hear them being supported by the timpani, and the timpani is playing the same rhythmic pattern, an 8th note to 16th notes. Da 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 da. As the section progresses, we start bringing in more lower-end instruments to add some depth and power to the sound. As you can see, I'm introducing the bass clarinet, the bassoons, and the bass trombone, the violas, and the cellos, and the contrabass. Now, violas aren't really a bottom-end instrument, but they still bring some nice color and resonance to the mix. And the tuba and the contrabasses work together like a nice drone effect. So we're not just hearing the staccatos, which could make everything sound a bit dry. Now we're bringing all the instruments together to push toward the final climax. Since we're writing heroic music, we need to pick the brightest brass instrument for this crucial, triumphant moment. Here's where I'm going to test your knowledge. I will play the ending of the music, and I want you to guess which instrument takes the lead. Ready, and... You're absolutely correct, it's the trumpet. So for these exciting moments, we always want the trumpets to be on the top because they are the brightest instruments in the brass section. While the trumpets take the lead, the rest of the instruments are providing harmonic support. Alright, now how do we decide which instruments play in what register and what doubling rules we should apply? I know it sounds like a total headache. First off, we need to understand each instrument's range and how they play nice with each other when doubling. There are some general rules, but honestly the best way to learn is through practice. Let's take the last 3 bars as an example. The piccolo usually plays an octave higher than the flute, but it does occasionally double the flute. Note that the piccolo sounds an octave higher than written. So even though we see the same notes for both the flute and piccolo, the piccolo is actually playing an octave higher. Then we've got the oboe and English horn. These guys tend to hang out in their middle and warmer registers. Sure, they could climb higher, but since we've already got the flute and the piccolo up there, we want to balance things out. So this is where we get some color in our wind section. Alright, now let's move down to the brass section. As we talked about earlier, the trumpets are the real heroes here, taking the spotlight in the melody. Horn 1 and 3 are doubling the violas, while 2 and 4 are doubling the cellos. We wrap up the treble clef, so now we can have a look at the bass clef. So moving down, we have the trombones. Remember that the trombones typically use the bass clef. In this lower register, we've got the trombones, and below them, the bass trombone, which of course plays lower than the regular trombone. Now with the tuba, you have 2 options. You can either double it with the bass trombone or have it play an octave lower. Here we don't want to sound too bass heavy, so we're doubling it with the bass trombone to keep the sound balanced. And let's not forget about the contrabasses. Typically, the contrabass doubles the tuba, giving us that powerful, brassier, and more resonant low end we want for a majestic and grand ending. So here's what you do. Select the tuba and copy it over to the contrabass. But remember, the contrabass is written an octave higher than it sounds, so make sure to adjust the transposition when you paste it in. We'll talk about more doubling rules later in this tutorial. Now that we've covered some doubling rules, there are 2 more key things to think about before and during composition: structure and harmony. I know a lot of you who subscribe to my channel come from a musical academic background, and you've studied form and harmony, passed your theory exams, and graduated successfully. And yet, one of the most common questions I get is, Hemi, what structure and chord progression did you use in this piece? And I always tell everyone, you already know this. It's ABA, it's 1-4-5-1. Of course, not all my pieces follow this pattern. Some use more complex jazz harmonies. In the analysis here, you will notice that the progression is actually pretty simple, and you probably have learned it. 1-4-1-5-1. And the structure is also pretty basic. It follows an A prime, then transitions into variation B, which is a variation of the main melody. After that, we have a solo passage, and then returns to an A variation, back to A again, then repeat before leading into the final cadence. So here's the thing, good music doesn't have to be complicated, and on the flip side, just because a piece has a complicated chord progression doesn't mean it's automatically good. If you'd like a copy of this analysis, let me know in the comments. If enough people request it, I will upload it to my MuseScore page so you can download it and use it as a reference for your own compositions. And of course, we will continue discussing the form and harmony of the piece throughout the rest of the tutorial. Let's jump into the main body of the music. I'll be comparing the score and the DAW side by side, highlighting key details you should pay attention to in your composing progress. Along the way, I will also share some useful tips you can apply to your next composition. If you're following along with the score on my MuseScore page, the rehearsal marking C is where the main section of the music begins. In the final recording, which you can find in the link below, the piece doesn't have the fanfare opening we talked about previously. Instead, it starts with a single bar of suspended cymbal before the rest of the players, including MIDI instruments, jump in at rehearsal marking C. Now let's take a look at this section. In this piece, we've chosen to use library samples for most of the instruments, while the brass section is written for live performers. And this approach allows us to achieve precise, intricate effects that would be challenging in a live performance setting. This fast woodwind section with 30-second notes would be incredibly difficult for a large group of wind players to play perfectly in sync. Using virtual instruments allows us to achieve perfect timing and synchronization, which helps create the effect we're going for. Contemporary soundtrack composing is largely a mix of orchestral instruments and synthesized MIDI sounds, which gives us far more flexibility than composers had 70 years ago when most film scores were purely recorded by live performers. So let's move to rehearsal marking C. The main melody is played by the French horns, so why do we choose the French horns specifically? The reason is because of its rich sound, the ability to create a majestic and heroic feeling. Let's do a quick comparison. I'll first play the main melody on the piano. So we have 1, 4, 1, 5, 1, 4, 5. So we have a simple progression and then a half cadence. As you can see, the melody itself is pretty simple. Now let's hear it again, played by the French horns. Now immediately you can feel that bold, adventurous energy. Now down below we have the first and second violins playing the tremolo. So why do we use the tremolo? Well, tremolo naturally blends with woodwinds, but beyond that, it serves two purposes. It helps the upper frequencies cut through the mix, and it prevents the high register from sounding too sharp or static. Now let's listen to the main melody along with the woodwinds and violins together. Notice how the woodwinds are playing a fast passage, not as a melodic element, but more as an effect, like a fast-moving wind. And then we add the lower brass and the rest of the string section, creating this bold and commanding eighth notes, bum bum. But we're not quite there yet. Percussion is the final piece of puzzle. It adds that extra weight to the eighth notes. Now let's hear everything together. Captain North America has stepped into the celebration, the crowd cheers excitedly, and now we've landed on a half cadence. But the moment isn't over yet. He still needs to march down the street with so many fans waiting to greet him. So now it's time to change up the instrumentation. Compared to the triumphant opening, this section has a more measured, steady pace, reflecting Captain walking past the crowd, lining the street. Here the mid to lower instruments and strings establish a steady walking pause, and symbolizing the soldiers marching alongside him. Notice the snare drum is playing a drag. The repeating pattern keeps the momentum moving forward, establishing this march-like character of the scene. Now let's bring in the main melody, which is played by the horns. And you'll notice that the melody transitions from the horns to the trumpets. Instead of having the same instrument carry the melody throughout, passing it to another instrument can add variety and keep things engaging. If we look at the score here, aside from the trumpet taking the lead, there's also doubling and octave doubling going on. And here as well. And then the strings. Alright, so in the next section, we're repeating the melody but switching up the orchestration. Instead of the brass carrying the main melody, now we have the strings take over, which gives it a different texture. At the same time, we've got the woodwinds, two horns, and glockenspiel to play a counter melody. The violas and contrabasses keep that steady eighth note rhythm going, while the cellos move in triplets. And then the brass joins at E1. They're really here to reinforce the harmony. That's why they play chords. And the trumpets are doubling the violins to give it a more brightness. This creates such a nice, expressive moment. In the movie, the camera is focusing on the supporting characters talking, while Captain North America is in the background signing autographs and interacting with his fans. I imagine some dialogue for this moment, and I will voice over as we listen to this section.
He's great with the crowd. Who doesn't love this guy?
Yeah, but does he ever take a break?
From being a hero? No.
All right, time's up. Let's get back to work and let him enjoy the spotlight.
So out of nowhere, we get this dramatic twist. The villain shows up again. He steps forward and his voice cuts through the stunned crowd, saying something like, "You celebrate too soon. Your so-called hero might win the battle, but the war, that's just starting." Then he lets out a dark chuckle and his voice echoing, and just like that, he disappears into the crowd. It's a total theatrical moment. Now, if we take a look at the notation, you will notice that the brass instruments use tenuto on certain notes. It's not quite the same as an accent, but it gives the notes a bit more weight, really emphasizing the gravity of the situation. And then we have the chromatic scale, which builds the sense of panic and chaos, kind of a sinister vibe. And the other instruments are either playing tremolo or sustained notes. And then you will notice a lot of dynamic shifts here, especially with the crescendos and decrescendos. Let's listen to this section and see how it all comes together. So after the villain vanishes, the crowd starts to gather around Captain North America again. They're still reeling from what the villain just said, totally stunned and unsettled. So they turn to Captain, hoping he will say something. In this part of the music, I've written a solo passage giving Captain a moment to give an empowering speech to bring everyone back together. If you have a different interpretation of any part of this music, comment below and I would love to hear your thoughts. So in this section, we use sotasto for the strings, but why sotasto instead of just sustained notes? The reason is we're trying to create a more atmospheric effect, and the sotasto is very soft. If we used sustained notes, it would sound too straightforward and missing that background and soft texture we're aiming for. So the sotasto technique blends really well with the soft brass sound. So along with the strings and the timpani roll, we've got the trumpet playing a solo passage. You'll notice I've marked concertino for the solo passage, which means with mute. So if you're not sure what the mute looks like, be sure to check out the full recorded video of this piece in the description below, where you will see the trumpet player and our French horn player using the mute during their solo part. Let's take a listen to this section. That sounds beautiful. I absolutely love the performance by the trumpet and the French horn players. Huge thanks to both of them. You might have noticed I added some bass drum hits here and there. To be honest, I didn't come up with that idea myself. I actually sent my mix to my good friend Eiko, who's an amazing keyboard player, and I told him something just didn't feel right. And he said, remember that Avengers Assemble scene in Endgame where all the heroes teleport through Doctor Strange's portals, the heavy percussion hits in the background. That's what you need here. So if you listen closely, the solos here are playing around with the main motif of the music, and you can even catch a few hints of the main melody. And this is an example of recycling an idea. Sometimes you don't have to come up with completely new concepts. All you need to do is take something you've already written, repeat it, and just to create a variation of it. At bar 106, we added in a few more instruments to play a forte and a piano, which really gives the section a bold and expressive quality. So as it progresses, we build up with a crescendo and then ease back into a decrescendo, letting the sound gradually fade out to wrap up the section. Now we're in the second half of the music and we're continuing to recycle the main melody, and let's call this a variation. So instead of starting from the very beginning, I pick up right after the half cadence, and we're following a 6-5-1-5 progression all the way to the end. The key signature, however, has changed, and so has instrumentation. Plus, instead of the march-like rhythm we had earlier, we're using a different rhythmic pattern here. So let's have a listen to the instruments playing the rhythm first. Now let's bring in the main melody. Alright, we're back to the main theme. After Captain North America's powerful speech, the crowd's faith in him is stronger than ever. Now he's leading us to victory. Here the trumpets are playing in unison with the violins for the main melody. It gives the sound a bright, powerful edge. Meanwhile, the clarinets are doubling the top line of the violas, and the bass clarinet and the contrabassoon are playing in unison with the cellos. Together they create a deep resonant foundation, and the bassoons, on the other hand, are doubling the bottom line of the violas. And my favorite part, horns are playing those warm 4-note chords. Let's give the horns a listen. The trombones and bass trombone are playing triads. I'm going to play them so we can identify the sound. At the very bottom, we have the contrabasses we haven't talked about. The contrabass typically doubles the cello an octave lower, and sometimes it plays intervals alongside them. Then we have the percussion group. If you listen to the percussion on its own, it doesn't sound like much, just rhythm, but you can still clearly recognize the rhythmic pattern. Let's solo the percussion section, including the harp, and we will have a listen. Even just from the percussion, you can tell this is marching music, though in this case it blends elements of both marching and fanfare styles. So I've grouped the triangle and glockenspiel into one part. Right now you're looking at the conductor's score, but if you check the individual parts, you will see that the triangle and the glockenspiel are combined. This is common in orchestral music since one percussionist often plays multiple instruments, and typically auxiliary percussion is kept separate from the main percussion section. For example, if you're playing marimba, you'd likely cover the glockenspiel as well, rather than switching to a triangle. But in this piece, since the glockenspiel and triangle don't overlap, I combine them into the same part. The finger symbols on the glockenspiel appear at the very end of this piece. It's a technique used to imitate the sound of cartelis if you don't have an actual set. If you watch the full video of this piece, which is linked in the description below, you will see the part where I perform the finger symbols on the glockenspiel. Now back in our DAW, let's take a listen from rehearsal marking I to the end. A few other points to mention. I like to clearly label divisi when the section of instruments is split into multiple parts, and when they return to playing the same line, I label it unison. Typically, we would use the abbreviations div dot for divisi and unis for unison. And whenever there's a dynamic change, it's important to include dynamic markings at both the start and end of a crescendo and decrescendo. For example, at bar 156, when I use a decrescendo, I specify what the dynamic will be at the end, whether it's a mezzo piano, etc. I wouldn't leave it without a dynamic marking at the end. When instruments are changing dynamics, it's typically best to unify the type of dynamic markings across the instruments. For example, at J1, if I want the main melody to be played forte, I would label the rest of the instruments forte as well. While we know the main melody should be generally louder than the accompaniment, it's up to the conductor to decide or to determine the balance and emphasis between the parts. So as an orchestrator, you don't need to micromanage that, and it's understood that the players, like the French horn section here, will typically be played louder and will naturally stand out. You can, of course, use double forte for emphasis, but avoid marking instruments with conflicting dynamic markings. For example, we don't want something like mezzo piano, mezzo forte, and this one will be piano. So this is not good. However, there are no strict rules when it comes to notation. We don't have to follow the old school conventions perfectly because we're not aiming to pass an orchestration exam. If there's ever any confusion, you can always communicate with your players and figure out what works best for the music. The most important thing is that you communicate your vision clearly through the sheet music. As long as the players understand what you're trying to convey, that's what matters. How you label it isn't as important as making sure your message comes through clearly. As I mentioned earlier, the brass section was recorded by live players, and from delivering the score to my brass players to receiving the recordings from them, there were no issues. So if you can write something like what we're seeing here, you won't run into any problems for sure. At the top, this entire section in red shows the recordings I received from the musicians. You'll notice there's a lot of automation going on, including tons of stretch markers. It's generally not recommended to use too many stretch markers on live recordings, as they can sometimes cause glitchy sounds or unnatural and unwanted noise, even though the stretch markers in Reaper still work pretty well. Now, if you're dealing with live recordings where the players are recording in different locations, it can get pretty tricky. That's because you don't have much control over the microphones they use or the environments they are recording in. In that case, we will need to use a lot of effects, EQing and reverb to match the sound and environment across all the instruments. Occasionally, we might also need to layer the live recording with a MIDI instrument if certain parts weren't captured well. Taking the snare drum recording as an example, if I play it on its own, you will notice it's missing a lot of the rattling noise. So what I did was layer it with a MIDI snare. The MIDI snare already has enough attack, so I reduced the mid to high frequencies to give space for the live recording to fill in. If you look at the live recording, we can see that it mainly occupies that space. This way we can create a more balanced sound, and together they sound so much better than the live recording by itself. A lot of people prefer to just improvise in their DAW instead of writing a score first. I often get questions like, should the score come first, or is writing a score even necessary? Well, it's always a good practice to write a score first because it gives you a clear idea of what you're doing. Just like when you're constructing a building, you need architectural drawings, floor plans, 3D models, and construction graphics before you actually start building. Thanks for watching this tutorial. Let me know in the comment section what other tutorials you'd like to see. Also, feel free to share if you found this tutorial too easy, just right, or too difficult, and if there's anything you'd like me to cover in the next cinematic composing tutorial. I hope you've learned a lot today, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and check out my other tutorials.